Hey, Daniel. Looks like you're there. I don't see you, but I know that you're there. Let me double check here. Let me admit you into the room. All right. All right. Hopefully you can see and hear me. I'm going to share.
I can.
All
But
right.
I've just arrived home with lunch, so I will be not visible and on mute part of the time while I get my family set up.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm just checking to make sure everything else is good. CPM now requires we use waiting rooms, so and I'm just going to check here. Okay. This is excellent connection, but I'm not getting anything, but that's okay.
Well, I can see and hear you just fine.
I'm just checking. Oh, there we are. I'm good. All right. It worked. I had to fix some links, so that's why. But we're good and we're set. I'm going to share screen and we're going to get started with the PowerPoint. I just wanted to make sure that everything was good. CPM has default set it so that I have to use the waiting rooms. So I was unable to change that setting. There were some protocols, and since I'm using the account now, this account does come out of my, missionary fund, but since they control the account, they didn't want any video bombing. So that's why they did that, and I'm complying with the breakout room protocol that has been set up. So let me go to share screen. We've got an exciting PowerPoint. I'd like it if I could share screen and you could still see me, but I don't know that that works. When I share screen, out of curiosity, this is a question I've had about Zoom, and just let me know whether I'm still visible. It's kind of a strange thing. I've been reading up on it, and apparently if you share screen by making the full screen the PowerPoint, you're not. Possibly.
I can see you and the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I see both. You're in the upper right-hand corner.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. There was some debate when I was viewing some of the YouTubes and paying attention to the protocols now with the waiting rooms and all of that stuff. So I just wanted to make sure that nothing they changed affected things. Again, it's our account, but because everyone is using their account, they're afraid of breach. We actually had one congregation that was video Zoom bombed with horrible stuff when they were broadcasting the preaching. I mean, swastikas and Nazi clips. It was really nasty. And so CPM, because of the kind of the violent response that came earlier, we don't know who did it, someone playing around or something, but it was inappropriate for a congregation of a lot of Jewish believers to see Nazi footage and swastikas and epitaphs on their screen with the preaching. So I understand their sensitivity. We are getting started. I am really excited about this YouTube. We've got some virtual helpers. So let me go back up here. Okay, now, first of all, I'm using a wonderful feature called Zoom in PowerPoint on Zoom. Isn't that ironic? And so I can go to different parts of the PowerPoint. And I just like playing around with it. I like making it better. So the take-home truth from last week is everybody will have an inheritance, but the inheritance of God's people is blessing. And by the way, I appreciated the sermon by Pastor Brian. I just kind of liked getting into what Peter and them was thinking a little. So that's basically our take-home from last week. And remember, we always review that. So it's not shocking that we did. Now, our friend Juan has joined us, one of my new virtual instructional assistants, and they ask really good questions. For those who are going on Zoom, I've been able to timestamp this on Zoom so that you can see sections of this or share sections of this I'm excited about that too, because it allows the questions that these virtual assistants be talking points. Juan is basically asking, what's the relationship between participation in the temple, or actually the tabernacle, and ritual cleanliness for the priests? We know a lot about it for everyday Israelites, but what about the priests? And Juan's asking the type of question that you should, and I think the questions are as important as the answers. For Jack, I'll be on George's show, and I just want to use some of this same format because I think it's really important that people open their Bibles, and what you need to do is ask God questions from the passage and let him answer you. For me, that makes it a really exciting discussion around God's word with the author. And so I do that, and I like helping other people pick really good questions and do that too. And so Juan wants to know about the relationship between ritual cleanliness and the priesthood in ancient Israel. And he's in the right passage to ask this question. When are priests ineligible for duty? Now, that ineligibility could be temporary, but it was a real live ineligibility. When would they profane the very offerings they were trying to offer and make them invalid, and thus interfere with the tabernacle? Because at that point, they would be interfering with God's system and not actually helping to promote and keep God's system flowing the way it's supposed to. And so that's what we're going to be looking at the first part of this. Now, Juan also wants to know how serious this is. And so while he's drinking his cup of coffee, he's curious as to, is this like a minor thing that's just a feature of the scriptures, or is it something really God took very seriously? And at the beginning of Leviticus, we get a feel for this. Now, the first verse follows the formula of indicating a new section, particularly in sections of the law. So when you have a series of ordinances or sections, God usually begins them the same way, and it acts as a natural division within the overall chapter, and it helps us to find what are called pericopes. If you're around me very long, you're going to hear the word pericope. My word processor, my dictation software hates the word pericope, but it's a very biblical word, and it's a very biblical concept to look at sections of something that pertain to something. In other words, in the larger chapter, you may have specific sections that indicate the flow of the text. And one of the great things that does is it allows us, as we look at the connections between these flows, to think God's thoughts after him. And so the beginning starts this section. You see the word then. It isn't a separate word in Hebrew. It's one of those Hebrew letters connected to a word, but we understand it as then, and it indicates the next thing in a sequence or in an order or in a flow. God spoke to Moses saying, we see this all the time. And so this tells us that a new section is started, new ordinances started. Listen up. If you were beginning to fall asleep during this, wake up, because there's new material coming. This is very detailed. It's very dense. Leviticus is not everybody's devotional book, but it really is incredibly valuable. And the problem we often have is that we have to translate what God is trying to display to these people in the Near East a long time ago and understand these principles and how they relate to today. So we have to understand the horizon of the audience and author, and then we make application. Now, I will let you know that one of the big problems is that people who try to follow the Bible often try to make the application and then go back to the text or read something into it. And we call that eisegesis. And that's a big fancy word for hi. You're sort of getting your own junk in the way of finding out what it says. Whereas exegesis is taking what was originally intended to that audience and then make application from there. And I would say that I am in a very real sense interested in the big picture, but even when I look at the big picture, I try to look of it in terms of the original intent. So I'm exegetical in my biblical theology. I know that sounds a little funny, but I like to take the best of systematic and bring it to this. So here's the story. to this Aaron and his sons. Now remember, these are the high priests. They have direct authority over the rest of the sons of Levi. God said that he gave the rest of the sons of Levi to Aaron and his sons and that line as a gift to help with this tabernacle, because it's a really, really big task. Not only was building it a big task, but maintaining this system is a very large task, and it's very central to Israel's experience of God and their relationship with God. So if they want to live in the community and do life with God, this is essentially the way they need to do it. And so this takes a real workforce. It's kind of like a small church. It takes a lot of people to make it work. And because I have Daniel here, and I know his lovely wife, who has been working with my lovely wife and does stuff that even my wife doesn't do and handles the children's stuff. And then Daniel, you're very involved in your own way, and everybody's playing their part. Well, the same thing was true here. And so Aaron is directed because he's going to need to take the material from the manual and reinforce it and explain it. Thanks. I'm not that good with the emoticons, but I appreciate the thumbs up. And by the way, if you're listening to this on YouTube, you can't do that, but you can always comment. If you're on Zoom, that's the one thing I wish YouTube had, but they do have the emoticons where you can type stuff in and put it up there. And some of the folks that listen on like Wednesday or Thursday, they have found emoticons for like chocolate cake and potato chips. I mean, just incredible stuff. So that's a whole other story, and I'm beginning to digress. That they separate themselves. Now that's a key concept in Leviticus from the holy things of the children of Israel, and they do not profane my holy name by what they dedicate to me. I am the Lord. Say to them, whatever of all your descendants through all your generations who goes near to the holy things which the children of Israel dedicate to the Lord, while he is unclean, upon him that person will be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. God is very clear that he takes this terribly seriously, because there are concepts here that are really important. And I want you to notice the word my presence, because that's a key concept and a key idea in the scriptures. If God is present, you are blessed. Cursing is separation from God, because God is the embodiment and source of all good in the universe. So to be away from his presence ultimately results in being deprived of the good things of life. Now, that deprivation may come immediately or it may come eternally, but the deprivation is still there. And so a key concept for the Israelites was to continue to have God's presence with them. For us who are believers, we're guaranteed God's presence. In the book of Hebrews, I will never leave you nor forsake you. In the new covenant, basically says, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And so the believer is guaranteed the presence of God, but the extent in which they experience that presence can still be influenced by how much they want to. And they show that through obedience and dedication. Much like any other relationship, if not tended to, it loses something. And so I am the Lord. Now, he constantly uses that phrase, and we're going to go back to it because it's a key phrase for the children of Israel. But the bottom line is, don't mess it up. Aaron, tell the priests and pay attention to these instructions I'm going to give your son. Do not mess with the tabernacle program, because it is key to my dwelling with my people. And you don't just wreck it for you, you wreck it for them. Okay? And so you don't want to do that. And so that's where we're at. Now, some of this didn't get recorded, but there'll be enough of it. The key presence being that God's presence is key. It's the source of blessing. Deprivation or cursing is the lack of God's presence. The believer has God's presence to a varying degree, depending on how cooperative they are with God being in their life. The unbeliever lacks that presence and will feel that deprivation. And that's where things kind of start. So this whole program is essential to Israel. Now we're continuing with Juan's question. What type of conditions might make a priest unable to function the way he's supposed to function? What are these things that will cause a priest to go ahead and defile the offerings of the children of Israel? Which, by the way, if a priest was to be negligent and do that, they themselves would be cut off from God's presence and be in a horrible position. They lose their job, they lose God's presence, they lose a whole lot. Now, most of these things only temporarily disqualify someone, but ignoring these things is permanent. By the way, this teaches us an important thing about God. The right thing done the wrong way is still unacceptable. And people don't often get that. So that's kind of key. The right thing done the wrong way still is unacceptable. The end does not justify the means in and of itself as far as God is concerned. There is a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And God is concerned about such things. Well, let's go further. Now we're joined by our friend Maria. She wants to know, what about the things related to the members of the household and the offering? Does this just affect the priests or does it affect his household? Now, that's a really good question. And Maria wants to know more about that. So what are the relationships within the priestly household? Where, first of all, the stranger is not allowed to be part of this. We're going to spend some time talking about that, okay? Now, as we get ready to talk about the household, we do need to let some information be gotten. This gets kind of again, okay? The things that would render a normal person unclean would render a priest unclean. Now that would seem to be logical to us, but people have a way of missing the connection between things. Okay? In verse 4, let me read it to you. Whatever man of the descendants of Aaron who is a leper or has a discharge may not eat of the holy things until he is clean. Now, once he's clean, he's eligible again. So this is temporary. Okay, and so that's really a big problem. If he decides to ignore these things, of course, then other penalties come in place. And whoever touches anything unclean by a corpse or a man who has had an emission of semen, I'm sorry, it's just there. Who says the Bible doesn't talk about the real things of life? I mean, I know this is like hard to take, but these things were important as far as ritual cleanliness. Now, the reason a corpse is interesting. Wow, question here. Do you mind if I take questions? Okay, yeah. Jack asked a question, and you may be interested in this, Dan. He said, did the ancient Israelites view prayer the same way we as Christians do? I mean, that's a really good question. And, you know, our virtual helpers didn't think to ask that. Specifically, how can I speak to God at any time? I do it through Christ, to whom at the time was the angel of the Lord. Okay, excellent point. I like the connection between the angel of the Lord and Christ, but Jack would know that. The tabernacle guaranteed God's presence among them, but prayer was not forbidden on a personal level. In other words, if you had some crisis, you could go to God. David does. Read the Psalms. He lives during the time of the tabernacle, and then remember, it's in Shiloh. Eventually, the Ark of the Covenant is brought, and a place is built for it. David did not hesitate to pray out to God all the time. In fact, God wanted relationship with his people. But to enjoy the presence of God as a corporate people, the tabernacle was there. So I'd say the funny thing with the ancient Israel view of God is that you had both God's presence physically among you and the corporate nature of that, and then you had the individual relationship with God, which you had to maintain in connection with that tabernacle. And so the ancient Israelite could pray at any time, but they still needed to engage.
I think the prophets give, many times the prophets would speak directly to God. They would pray to God. So, I kind of see that as an affirmation of that question as well. Not just David. There's There's a lot of examples.
Yeah, I want to be careful of going back to Abraham or Isaac or them because they're pre-tabernacle. So they're not in the same place on the timeline of sacred history. But you see that with David, you see it with Eli, you see it with, well, Hannah's at the, but when she praises God after she conceives, she's not at the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was necessary to maintain community connection and to know that the community was in the presence of God, but individual prayer was acceptable. So you had those sort of two prongs. And the Jewish person still does today because the synagogue is highly regarded. And so the Jewish person has this prayer book that's the corporate prayer book. And then as an individual Jew, the prayer book allows for individual prayer. I mean, the rabbis would never say you couldn't pray individually, but they'd say you need to get together with Israel and pray corporately. And by the way, isn't that true of the believer? I mean, we've really sort of ignored the whole dimension of corporate prayer in the church. And I've seen that kind of really kind of disappear, particularly in the Western church where we're over individualized. But we don't usually see that. There used to be like Wednesday night prayer meetings. There used to be prayer gatherings. The Western church has forgotten the dynamic of corporate prayer to a large extent. The Israelite had both of those wings. The Jewish person, unfortunately, focuses too much on the corporate prayer book and not enough on personal prayer, but they have both those wings. The church should really have both of those wings, but I think the church is focused on individual prayer to the extent where corporate prayer has become a little bit less of a thing. So that's a long answer, but I think it's a very insightful one as we look at the church and we look at Israel and we look at kind of that whole thing. So hope I got you your answer, Jack. I probably got you more than your answer. I don't know. Dead was real important. Those who claim to be high priests or of the lineage of the Kohen do not touch the dead. I had relatives that I was a pallbearer. They could not directly come in contact with the dead. We're going to see an exception for that later on, but we need to understand that that's still a big thing. If you touch something unkosher, you're unkosher. Excellent. So that's the creeping thing in verse 5. If you touch any such thing, you're unclean until evening. So it wasn't permanent. It was temporary, but you have to go ahead and you couldn't eat of the offerings until you were ritually clean again. And when the sun goes down, of course, you could. If you ate something treif or touched something treif, you were unclean. Now, treif means torn. And so the word here, that's the verb, a person who touches any such thing, wait a minute, that dies naturally or is torn, treif, by beasts, he shall not eat to defile himself with it. I am the Lord. And so there you have that whole section there that ends up dealing with that. But the term treif is still used for something that's unkosher. And so you could not go ahead until you were clean again. 9 comes into Maria's question. I should have gone back to Maria's question. She says, well, what about the priest's family? I touched something unclean, and the priest didn't touch something unclean, because remember, the family got to share in the offerings to a certain extent. What's the relationship between ritual uncleanness and the family and outsiders, those who were not directly of the priestly line? Well, first of all, no outsider can eat the holy things. One who dwells with the priest or a hired servant shall not eat of the holy things. So the extension of the priest's freedom to eat the offerings did not go with the outsider or a hired servant. Now, that's a hired servant. Be careful there. There were indentured servants, and so that's slightly different. But they were outside the line. And that's going to lead to a question too, because this sounds a little odd. And Maria says, well, why is God so exclusive? I mean, in our pluralistic society with everybody having rights and nobody could be restricted in any way based on their background, this seems highly prejudicial, doesn't it? And so Maria asks the question up there in the title, and so she gets a message back. Well, Maria, distinctions from the backdrop, these distinctions from the backdrop of the New Testament, God had created certain boundaries to prevent Israel from being absorbed into the nations. Additionally, the priesthood was vital to God's plan in terms of preserving Israel as a theocratic nation. So the plan of God and the necessity to keep Israel separate at this particular time in sacred history is part of the reason that God creates these boundaries. And we need to understand that God needed to create boundaries to preserve this nation as a beachhead because they held a place that was vital to his plan. So sometimes what Maria needs to understand is that God creates certain restrictions or qualifications to preserve something that is vital or connected to his plan. Now, in this case, it's Israel as a theocracy. And she still wants to know a little more about this. Well, how does this relate to today? Well, in the New Testament, these distinctions are removed. Now, I don't like what Christopher Wright says, that there's no longer Jew or Gentile in Christ. What he means by that, I like. Okay? I agree with him. I just think the wording is a little unclear. There is no longer a difference in position between Jew and Gentile in Christ. Okay? But one new humanity. Now, it doesn't mean there's no longer identity in Christ, because there's neither male nor female. But at Hillside, I don't go into the girls' bathroom. So we're not talking about identity. We're talking about position. We need to make that understanding clear in our minds. Okay, identity does not disappear. Identity and culture and stuff is what God wants to sanctify. What changes is there is no hierarchy of position ethnically, linguistically, or physically. I don't like the word race because there's one human race. There are different ethnic groups or ethno-linguistic groups, to use the language of New Tribes Mission or Wycliffe Bible translators. Okay, but one new humanity, okay, that's being in the second Adam, reconciled to God and each other through him. Since Christ has fulfilled the sacrificial function, now remember, these distinctions we're looking at are connected to the sacrificial function of the priesthood. There is no continued separate order of priests in the Christian church. This is where the Catholic Church needs to get their heads squared up right. There is no continuing priesthood in the sense of Israel. The temple curtain was torn, access to God was open to all through the sacrifice of the blood of Christ. 1 Peter 1:19. Christopher Wright is right. I'm just clarifying his language because his language could be misconstrued that there's no longer ethnic identity in Christ. I don't think that that's true. Or there's no longer gender identity in Christ. And I think Maria would have problems with that, being a sensible, young lady. Okay, so we need to move on. What sacrifices are acceptable? Now let's move on in our text a little bit here. Okay, the stranger can't have them. We're going to go to her next question here, which is really the next section. But we do need to realize that there was a little bit more to it than just the stranger, because there were indentured servants. Okay. And that's verse 11. But if the priest buys a person with his money, he may eat of it, and one born in his household may eat his food. Now, what's going on there? And the reason I didn't want to move into Maria's next question is because very, very clearly, If I purchase somebody as an indentured servant, they become a part of my household. The painter who visits your house and paints your house is not a permanent part of your household. In fact, if he decides to stay for the rest of his life, you may have problems with him. Hi, I'm here to paint your house. By the way, I will now be living with you. Not necessarily a really good idea, but if I was purchased under indentured servitude, I then was working for you to pay off a debt. I became as a member of your household, and one born in your household may indeed eat of it. Understand, back in Abraham's day, which is before this, even back then, the indentured servant was considered a member of the household. We know that because God says to Abraham, will Eliezer of Damascus, my steward, be my heir? See, if he did not have a child, Eliezer of Damascus would have been the inheritor of his stuff. And God says, no, clearly I gave you a promise. It's going to come to be. Eliezer's not going to inherit, but you do need to understand that concept there, that the one born to the household or the indentured servant was considered as a member of the household in all forms. But now we have a problem because girls marry. I just had my middle daughter marry. Well, now whose household is she under? See, Maria's asking about households and relationships to the priest's family, which would include those indentured servants, but not the hired servant. What about daughters? I mean, now you have a daughter issue, right? What if the priest has girls? I've got 3. Verse 13, but if the priest's daughter is a widow or divorced and has no children and has returned to her father's household, as in her youth she may eat of her father's food, but no outsider shall eat of it. Now, the girl is in the situation of having married a man, okay, and divorce happens, but they've not yet had children for whatever reason. Now, we've talked about divorce in other programs related to Matthew, but you do need to understand in ancient Israel, there was a permission to divorce under certain circumstances. And let's say this thing happened. God isn't saying it should happen. He's creating a provision if it does happen. And so he says, let's say a young girl marries, they've not had children, she ends up divorced. If she comes back under her father's roof, as she did when she was unmarried, then she may eat of things. Now, understand that in the ancient world, there were not all these single career women running around. We don't get this in society. If a girl was not married, she was likely living under her father's authority. There was no such thing. Now, how do I respond to our world today? I think the freedom of a young woman to have some economic means so she is not dependent as much on parents, especially in this sort of society, is not a totally bad thing. But I will say this, I have some people who think that once your child's 18, you show them the door and kick them in the rear end. And I've had people come to me and kind of be a little judgmental that my children are paying rent, but they are still a part of my household. As long as they are contributing to the household and they are working and they are young adults, I have no problem with us living as an extended family. This used to happen in the biblical period all the time. And I think we're going to see more of this with the economy. So no, you do not get kicked in the back end with your stuff thrown on the front porch when you turn 18. However, if you're going to, use that in a negative way, then your responsibilities are still responsibilities. So that's kind of the way I look at it. The reason I bring it up again is that some people, especially in certain cultures, feel that their adult children should be heard and not seen. Like they should call you once a week, whether you need it or not. I don't see that as being particularly biblical. So I'm going to say that's between you and your household. But I do not think it is incumbent on Christian parents to do that. Any thoughts, comments? You're welcome to throw them up there. Maybe I'm not being mean enough. I especially feel that's true in the case of gals, not because they're less than men, just because, I don't know, there was an old rock song. I'm trying to think of who did it. It was kind of folk rock. Ooh, baby, it's a wild world sort of thing. It can be a rough world out there. Enough said. Maria wants to know a little bit more about, well, which sacrifices are accepted. We know what would make a priest unclean. What doesn't make a priest unclean? What indeed composes a sacrifice that would be acceptable in and of itself from the Israelite standpoint? And what can you bring to the priest and get away with it, and what can't you bring? Okay. There is a provision in case you mess up accidentally. Now, I like that. This is max up accidentally. This is verse 14. If a man eats the holy offering unintentionally, he shall restore the holy offering to the priest and add a fifth to it. A fifth was restitution. Now, the Bible has this concept of restitution, which is utterly lacking in our society, which, by the way, leads to injustice. Okay. Again, mercy and justice need to be flip sides of the same coin. Okay. But there is this concept that if you take something unlawfully, it is not enough to give back the unlawful thing, but you need to do restitution in order to right the wrong. The idea is that we're supposed to seek to right those things that are wronged. And so what happens if the offering, they put out the burnt offering on the table. I am in the precincts. I have a right to be in the precincts. The chicken leg looks good. I'm being a little facetious here. We had some leftover fried chicken in the house, and I accidentally pick up a wing, and I don't know who's it from or what's going on. And so I take a bite of that. Now, that's problematic. Okay. And so that's what we're sort of dealing with here. And there's a provision. You have to give back of worth plus 1/5. And so that's the provision that's left there. But you can't do it intentionally. Now, the Bible makes a difference between intentional sin and unintentional sin. Okay. Sin that is intentional, deliberate, and defiant is called sin of the high hand. Sin of the high hand had no sacrifice. In other words, you could not be deliberately disrespectful to God and defiant and expect there to be a restitution aside from pleading for God's mercy and accepting his grace. And it had to be a sincere effort on your part. There was no sacrifice for the sin of the high hand. Now, Rabbi Singer uses this to say blood atonement is not what God wanted. No, that's not true. There are ideas that a sacrifice might temporarily give a stay, and the seeking of God's mercy was the ultimate answer. But the idea here is not that blood atonement's not necessary. It is that defiance is unacceptable. And that's what God's getting at here. And so that while there's an allowance for the accidental non-sin of the high hand, defiant sin was looked at differently. And so that's why there's a difference in provision. They shall not profane the holy offerings of the children of Israel, which they offer the Lord, or allow them to bear the guilt of trespass when they eat their holy offerings. I am the Lord, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. And God's essentially saying, you're not going to mess this up. I'm going to put limits on this. I'm going to put boundaries on this. I'm not going to let you to mess with it. Well, our little virtual helper, Maria, there has been very patient as we've gone through this text. Of course, she has no choice being a virtual assistant, but nevertheless, what sacrifices are acceptable? Now that we know what isn't acceptable, it might be nice to talk about getting to the point of what isn't acceptable. God does this the way he does a lot of things. He defines what isn't okay, and whatever is left is sort of what he's shooting for. So not only could the priest do this the wrong way, and the sacrifice would be rendered unacceptable, which God doesn't want, but the Israelite could do this the wrong way. See, both parties could mess this up in a big way. And so what if the priest is doing his job correctly and the children of Israel decide to mess up, or even the stranger among them? The Lord spoke to Moses saying, now what does that tell us? We've hit a new pericope. We've hit a new section. Speak to to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel. They need to hear this too. Okay, get the message out to all of them and of the strangers in Israel. Everybody needs to get this down, because this isn't the priest messing up anymore. This is you messing up. Okay? Whoever offers a sacrifice or any vows or any free will offerings which they offer to the Lord as a burnt offering. And so let's get to Maria's question here. There we go. This is the whole text there. You'd be better reading it from your Bible, but I've made it available. The problem is I really hate doing 5 different slides. Like slide 1, slide 2. I got to find a clever way of dealing with that. And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel. And here's the whole section. And to all the children of Israel, saying to them, whatever man of the house of Israel or stranger in Israel who offers a sacrifice for any of the vows or for any of his free will offerings, which they offer to the Lord as a burnt offering, you shall offer of your own free will, male without blemish, from the cattle, from the sheep, or from the goats. Whatever has a defect, you shall not offer, for it will not be accepted on your behalf. And whoever offers a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord to fulfill a vow, or free will offering from the cattle or from the sheep, it must be perfect to be accepted. They shall have no defect. Those who are blind or broken or maimed or have an ulcer or eczema scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord, or make an offering by fire of them on the altar of the Lord, either bull nor lamb that has any limb too long or too short you may offer as a free will offering, but for a vow it shall not be acceptable. You shall offer to the Lord you shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed, torn or cut, nor shall you make any offering of them in your land, nor from your foreigner's hand shall you offer these as the bread of your God, because there is corruption in them and defects in them. They shall not be accepted on your behalf. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when a bull or sheep or goat is born, it shall be 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day and thereafter it may be accepted as an offering made by fire to the Lord, whether it be cow or ewe. Do not kill both her and her young on the same day. When you shall offer a thanksgiving offer to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten, and you shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. Therefore you shall keep my commandments and perform them. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, for it is hallowed among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. Now that's very, very lengthy. Let's break it down so that we can get Maria her question, which sacrifices are acceptable? The first thing that we know is, as far as acceptable sacrifices, second-class sacrifices are not acceptable. Now, why would somebody do this? Because getting rid of the less valuable parts of your flock costs you less money, and it also gets rid of the deformed, so you're less likely to have another generation with deformations in it. In other words, it's a way of cleaning the genetic pool. But that's not the goal. The free will offering is just that. It's a free will offering. It's to be given from the heart freely, and it has to be perfect to be accepted. Okay, now there's an exception made, the difference between an offering and just a peace offering, and that's because the offerings are different. Okay, but as far as the free will offering, which was often offered for a vow, they have the free will offering for a vow, it won't be acceptable. So if you are giving an offering in order to perform a vow, a promise to God, you don't degrade it. Now, understand what could go on here. I could decide to make an offering to God and say, I have to be careful. I make a vow, Lord, I need you to do this. If you do this, I will offer you something. And then when it comes time to pay that vow, I take the maimed and the deformed as a way of making the vow less expensive. So I promised you $5, but I give you $2.50. And that's not acceptable. So there's no shading on the deal here. Okay? You can't do it, and you can't do it offering a foreigner's offering. Now, note that indicates that some of the sojourners among the children of Israel, while they didn't have full rights, may indeed enter in on some level to the worship of God. Understand that this plays into the New Testament term of Gentiles who were God-fearers. So that in the first century period, you had Jews and then you had God-fearing Gentiles who had adopted some of the ethics and monotheism and customs of Israel, even though they were not Jews. One of the examples of this is Acts 10 with Cornelius the centurion. And this becomes the basis for dealing with those, because God indeed made laws for the sojourner among you, the Gar. And interestingly enough, there were Gentiles who joined into the worship of God, but they did not have all the rights of a full member of Israel. In this case, even an offering from a foreigner that was bruised and crippled to fulfill an oath or vow was unacceptable. However, as a peace offering, that was acceptable on a limited basis. And there was a difference in those offerings. Now, let's get to some really, really practical stuff as we prepare. It's all practical. What's practical about this section is don't give God second best. There you go. What principle can I derive from Leviticus chapter 22? Okay. 1, God has removed certain barriers that he gave Israel so that all may freely come to him in Jesus Christ. 2, don't give God second best. Always give God your best. And you see that God made provision for family in this case of the priests, because they lived off the offerings of the children of Israel. But even with that, put some restrictions. Now let's talk about Maria's good question. She's listening all this, and she sees that God keeps saying that you will guard and keep my commandments, for I am the Lord. Did you notice how many times the phrase I am the Lord appears in this section? We've been looking at section 22. We have I am the Lord throughout this passage in several places. verse 30. We have it in verse 16. We have it at the very beginning. Verse 2 of 22, we have this phrase, I am the Lord. It is usually connected with the phrase that you will keep my commandments and do them. And you will see this a lot in the scriptures. He consistently uses the words to keep or to guard. Shamar actually means to guard. And it is the idea of guarding something either by protecting it directly or by preserving it through doing. So when Jewish people think of keeping God's commandments, it is not separate from doing God's commandments. There's no intellectual assent for the Israelite in the sense that to believe something is to do something about it. And that's why you have Shimartam mitzvotai ve'asitem. And then you have the Ani Adonai. I'm going to say Adonai. Jews don't pronounce that name, so you just allow me that cultural distinctive here because the vowel markings are missing. So who's God to you? I think about that. Make that a devotional question. Who is God to you? Who does the Bible say God is to you? Who does the Bible say God is? And who is God to you? What roles do you resonate with God? What things is God that you need God to be in your life? If you lack peace, then God needs to be your peace giver. If you need provision, then God needs to be your provider. If you are having extreme health problems that God is taking you through, God may need to be your sustainer or your healer. Who is God to you? One of the questions that came up on Facebook this morning, I'll admit it, I do my trolling, essentially was, does God have the right to tell us what we can do and can't do? If God is the king of the universe, you better believe he has the right. And so, yeah, God does have the right to go ahead and do that. He is free to go ahead and do that. And so, something to think about. By the way, the fact that most people think God does not have the right to tell them what to do with their life means that God is not the king of the universe, the creator, the maker and possessor of the earth and all the fullness thereof. But for the believer, God should be all of those things. At the risk of being dangerously political before November, God is the one who determines how I vote. Now, how well I'm listening may be another question. But ultimately, what the Christian can say is what determines what I vote is God, and that's the way it should be. Party affiliation is secondary to Christ, but moral positions are not separatable from my ballot. So if God is indeed for life, then I need to be for life. I need to align with God's moral values when I vote. I've told some people that no matter how you vote, what will not be determining how I vote is what I get. A lot of people are voting economically in the sense of what they've been promised. What I've been promised is not the issue. And so be careful. And remember to allow God to be the Lord who sanctifies you. What about that title, Lord? Because it really isn't Lord. Your English Bible translates it as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The reason your Bible does that is because Jews didn't pronounce it. There are no little dots underneath or above any or alongside any of those Hebrew consonants because the vowels are missing. We do not know how to pronounce that name. People try to get close. Some of them do get close, but I'm going to be honest with you. We, on a biblical level, do not have an absolute knowledge of the vowels that go there. What Jews began to do is pronounce the vowels associated most likely with that form of name. In other words, the way that name would have to probably most likely appear. So they take the vowels Adonai, and the consonants are connected to the vowels. It's kind of weird. If you take the vowels from Yahovah and you mix them with the consonants connected with Lord, you get that sort of thing. And so what Jews will do is they don't pronounce that name. That's the long and short of it, because we don't have the vowels written down. They pronounce it as Adonai. So that's the way I'm pronouncing it. What's the big deal about that name? Where does it come from? Why does God say, I am the Lord? Not, I am the king, I am God, I am the God of alone. He could do that. He does that in some places. Why pick this very, very obscure, hard to conjugate word? Because it's from a hard to conjugate verb. The verb to be, haya, is what's called a weak verb. It's a triple weak verb. If God had tried to pick a hard verb to conjugate, he couldn't have picked a harder one, virtually. I mean, this is really, really a hard verb to conjugate. It's the form of be. And so it indicates God's self-existence. Now, what the prayer book does in some places now is, instead of writing the Lord, they say the eternal. Blessed art thou, the eternal our God. Because they're going back to this verb to be. And it indicates God's self-existence. All of us are creatures. We are dependent. I have to eat. I better sleep. Last night was great. I better sleep. I better eat. I better breathe. Okay, I figured that out during exercise. If I don't breathe, I have problems. I am dependent. I am a creature. Creatures by nature are dependent beings. God is self-existent and self-sustaining. He needs nothing outside himself. That's real important. In things like Hinduism and pantheism and other things, God is not self-existent. Okay? In the same way. In ancient theologies of false gods, particularly some, they required things. Okay, you were literally sending the gods food. God is self-existent and self-sufficient. He doesn't need you and me. I remember this story of Ravi Zacharias being approached by a Hindu man who said, well, if God doesn't need us in any way, why does he bother? And Ravi Zacharias turned to him and said, and now you are close to the kingdom. He is eternal. He is self-sustaining. That means all his attributes are constantly always there. They're self-sustained and they're timeless. That's one of the reasons that God ends up referring to himself in connection with this title as the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to further show that he is connected. Now, there's a lot to that to unravel, because he's connected with humanity, because he's the God of humans. So he's forever connected himself with humanity. But also he's connected in time and space and covenant. When this word Adonai is used, it's used in a covenant context, particularly God's dealings with Israel. So some have said this is the covenant name of God, and there's some sense to that. I am the Lord. Anochi Adonai, a key phrase. Okay, well, it looks like Maria and Juan have gotten most of their questions answered today. And so if this ends up on YouTube the way I hope it does, I can timestamp this. I cannot do this on Zoom. I cannot do this on Facebook as of yet. But this is fun because now clips or sections of this can be used by people, shared, pointed to, and it allows me even to raise questions from the clips. So I don't know that anyone anywhere else has been watching. My little thing says that there's no one there, but I know there is. So that's kind of the funny thing about that. But who am I to disagree with the incredible technology that's out there? I'm trying to see. Oops. Well, Jack, you're welcome. While I try to go back here and see. The one thing about my computer, my son keeps saying a second monitor would be a good idea, and I'm beginning to agree with him. But this is on automatic pause or stop, so I'm going to stop sharing the thing as soon as I figure out exactly how. There it is. Stop share. Okay, so I'm back here. And that's where we're at. This is on an auto stop. So when I leave the meeting, the Facebook will stop. You're very welcome, Jack. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I don't know why you didn't show up on my little chat thing as far as viewers, but it could be because it goes through Zoom. So that is the way of things. Okay, Dan, you're going to take off and I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you all for being there. Daniel, you are incredibly faithful. Thank you. And I'm grateful to the other folks who chime in occasionally. So God bless. Have a good week.
Thanks, you too.
Okay.